Welcome back to Catalyst University. My name is Kevin Tokoph. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel for future videos and notifications. In this video, we're going to discuss the general mechanism by which keratinocytes receive increased pigmentation or increased melanin. And we're going to come at it from the focus of, say, what happens when you go and get a tan. So you start out with lighter skin, you have prolonged exposure in the sunlight, and you end up with tanner skin. Why does that occur? We're going to save the genetic factors for why people have a baseline darker skin or lighter skin for the next video, where we actually cover the pathway for melanogenesis. Here we're just going to answer, why do people get a tan? So first of all, some basics. Remember that the keratinocyte is just the general skin cell, and they exist in all 5 layers of the skin. In the deepest layer, we have the stratum basale, and going superficially, we have the stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, the stratum lucidum, which is only in thick skin, and then, of course, the superficial layer, the stratum corneum. Okay? And these are going to serve a protective role of the epidermis. The melanocyte is what makes the melanin. The keratinocyte does not make the melanin. The melanocyte makes the melanin, and the melanocyte then delivers that melanin to the keratinocyte. Now, melanocytes only exist in the stratum basale. Of course, the keratinocytes exist everywhere in the epidermis, but melanocytes are only in the stratum basale. And so this process where they make the melanin and transfer it to the keratinocyte, that actually occurs in the stratum basale. Okay? So what's going on here when someone has increased exposure to the sun? So in the first step, generally, the keratinocytes receive increased exposure to UV light, which could possibly damage DNA and introduce mutations. So UV light is a very high energy form of radiation. And so that light is going to penetrate through your skin cells, through the epidermis, and ultimately to the cells in the stratum basale. Now remember, the superficial layers of the skin, that is the stratum corneum, the stratum lucidum if we're talking about thick skin, and the stratum granulosum, at least about half of those cells, they don't have nuclei. And so there's no reason to worry about the DNA damage in those cells because there's no nucleus. They've already jettisoned their nucleus. But in the stratum basale, there is a nucleus, and those cells are mitonically active. So we have to have a way to protect that underlying DNA. And so if this light from the sun penetrates these cells and hits the DNA, which it can cause DNA damage, which we see depicted here in this little circle. Now, when DNA gets damaged, there's a DNA damage response. This is the type of negative feedback. So DNA damage stimulates a protein called P53. P53 is a transcription factor which is induced whenever there's damage to the DNA. But overall, P53 increases the expression of another protein called POMC. POMC is a large protein that serves as a precursor protein to a lot of other different types of hormones. This part in red, which is in the middle, is actually alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone. Okay, so alpha MSH. And so POMC can be cleaved, and it can release alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone. And notice that that alpha MSH can then be released out of the keratinocyte, and it can travel to a nearby melanocyte. Okay? So, alpha MSH is going to increase the expression of enzymes and other proteins needed for synthesis of melanin and melanosomes, and that's going to occur on the melanocyte. So this alpha MSH that's released by the keratinocyte is going to bind to this receptor called MC1R. This is the receptor that binds alpha MSH. And when it binds to this receptor, it's going to trigger a series of intracellular events inside the melanocyte that ultimately cause changes in gene expression, and those changes in gene expression allow an increase in the proteins and enzymes necessary to make melanin. Now, we see here this leads to pigment production. So the melanin inside the melanocyte is made in an organelle called a melanosome. So it's important to distinguish between the melanocyte and the melanosome. The melanocyte is the entire cell. Okay? The melanosome are these little organelles that you see here, and those melanosomes are the sites of melanin synthesis, and melanin is made inside of these little organelles called melanosomes. And so when you have these changes in gene expression, ultimately due to this DNA damage in the keratinocyte and resulting release of alpha MSH, that triggers the production of melanin inside these melanosomes. Okay, now the melanocyte is capable of producing all these dendrite-like structures, and in some cases they may resemble pseudopodia, little arms that stick out. And so what the melanocyte can do with these arms is it can dock with this keratinocyte that's nearby, okay? And these arms can extend and ultimately, for a moment, fuse with the keratinocyte, okay? And once this arm right here of the melanocyte fuses with the cell, this keratinocyte, you can have these organelles travel through the arm and ultimately be transferred into the keratinocyte. And that's going to allow the melanocyte to transfer these melanosomes into the keratinocyte, okay? And so now you have here all these melanosomes inside the keratinocyte. Now we're not done here because these melanosomes don't just sit here. Rather than staying static, they actually release their internal contents, meaning these melanosomes degranulate. And by releasing internal contents, we mean releasing the melanin pigments that are inside. And so these melanin pigments tend to cluster around the nucleus, and that shields the nucleus of these keratinocytes from incoming ultraviolet rays from the sun. And the reason this works so well is the molecule melanin, which actually is a polymer, as we'll see in the next video. Melanin is able to absorb the light from the sun. And so these UV rays are going to hit the melanin instead of the DNA. So these melanin polymers are going to act like a shield. They absorb the light, and then the light has to go somewhere, so the energy from that light is instead dissipated as heat. And this is actually a process called internal conversion, although that's not normally necessary for most classes. But that's what happens. The melanin that's around the nucleus absorbs the UV light from the sun and dissipates that energy as heat. And that way, less ultraviolet light strikes the DNA and it reduces the chance of mutation. And so ultimately what this is a negative feedback loop in order to protect these cells' DNA and the nucleus whenever you're exposed to ultraviolet light from the sun. And so when you have more melanin in these keratinocytes, that gives the appearance of a tan. Okay? Now that's the mechanism by which you get increased pigmentation just by going out in the sun. As we know, different ethnicities of people from different regions have baseline different amounts of melanin. For example, Europeans, particularly Northern Europeans who are white, will have a lot less melanin than people from African regions, Middle Eastern regions, India, and so on and so forth. And so we'll cover the reason for that in the next video. But I will just say this to preface that. The reason that people have a different baseline level of melanin does not have to do with more melanocytes. In fact, pretty much every human has the same level of melanocytes. Rather, people that have more melanin naturally, so people who have naturally darker skin, are going to have more melanocyte activity. So for their given number of melanocytes, which are the same as everybody else's, those melanocytes will have more activity. And so they're going to, by default, have more enzymes and proteins needed to make those pigments, like melanin. Okay? So hopefully that makes sense. Join us in the next video. And please make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel for future videos and notifications. Thank you very much.